So, you want to know if Jan Hus is an Orthodox saint?
Well, yeah, it's a question that comes up a lot.
It does seem like one of those topics where there are a lot of opinions, even within Orthodoxy.
Definitely, yeah. You'll find folks on both sides of it.
And what makes it even more interesting is this whole idea that Rome considered him a heretic, but in a way, it was for being too Orthodox.
It is a fascinating twist.
To get to the bottom of all this, we'll be diving deep, and for this deep dive, we're lucky enough to have just one expert source to help us sort through it all.
I'm excited to dive in.
Me too. To understand these viewpoints, maybe we should start with Hus himself. Who was he, and what was he fighting for?
Well, Jan Hus lived in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. A time of great turmoil for the Catholic Church.
Oh, yeah, first
He was a Catholic priest who became a pretty prominent critic of some of the church's practices, like, indulgences and purgatory.
Right, two big issues at the time.
And he even advocated for communion in both kinds.
Now, that's interesting because that's a practice that the Orthodox Church retained.
That's right, the Catholic Church had moved away from it, but Hus was calling for a return to it.
So he was a Catholic reformer, but some of his reforms sound pretty Orthodox.
He was. It's almost like he was a radical traditionalist, seeking to go back to those earlier forms of Christianity, the ones that were more aligned with the Orthodox tradition.
It really is kind of a paradox.
It is.
So Rome condemned him as a heretic for this. They thought he was promoting orthodoxy.
They did. And this is where things get really interesting, especially when it comes to your question about sainthood.
Okay, how so?
Well, you see, in the Orthodox Church, just being condemned by Rome doesn't automatically make you a saint.
Of course, right. There has to be, genuine holiness. So where does that leave Jan Hus?
Right. It's more nuanced than that.
Was he actually Orthodox?
While a lot of his beliefs and practices do seem to line up with Orthodoxy, he never formally joined the Orthodox Church.
I see. He saw himself as a Catholic.
He did, yeah, he was a Catholic trying to reform his own church.
Okay, so not officially Orthodox, but he did die for beliefs that the Orthodox Church upholds. Would that at least count for something?
This is where that whole idea of baptism by fire comes in.
Okay, I think some people listening, myself included, might need a bit of a refresher on what baptism by fire means.
Sure. Baptism by fire is the idea that martyrdom, dying for your faith, can be a path to sainthood even if you haven't formally converted.
Okay, I'm following you.
And it gets even more interesting with Jan Hus.
Why is that?
Because right before his execution, he was reported to have recited a version of the Jesus prayer.
Hold on, now this is getting really interesting. So was that a common thing back then, or did he deliberately choose this prayer?
That's the question, isn't it? It's a detail that really adds intrigue to the debate around Hus.
Definitely.
On the one hand, the Jesus prayer is so central to Orthodox spirituality.
Yeah, for sure.
So the fact that he uttered it right at the end, well, that could be seen as really significant.
Almost like a last-minute conversion, even if it wasn't intentional.
Maybe. But we have to be careful about reading too much into things. We don't know for sure what was going on in his head in those final moments.
Sure.
Or even if he fully understood the significance of that prayer within Orthodoxy. It's a real historical puzzle.
It is. So we've got this Catholic reformer advocating for practices the Orthodox Church holds dear, condemned by Rome, and then right before he dies, he recites a distinctly Orthodox prayer.
He really was dancing between those two worlds.
He was. Now, something your source brings up is this. Is there a tendency to venerate someone based on, their ethnicity or their opposition to another group?
That's a great question and something we have to be really mindful of.
Does that apply to Hus?
It's certainly something to consider, and I think it connects to another example.
Okay, what's that?
Well, you've mentioned before that I personally venerate Cornelio Codriano.
I have, yeah. He's a figure who, how should we say, sparks debate.
He does, and that's putting it mildly. He was a Romanian figure, deeply religious, a martyr in my view, but his political legacy, well, it's complicated, to say the least.
That's one way to put it.
But just because I personally venerate him, that doesn't mean he should be officially recognized as a saint.
So it's more about holiness, not just whose side you're on.
Right. It's about looking at their life and how they lived out their faith, not just who their enemies were.
So where does all of this leave us with Jan Hus? Saint or not? Should we even be asking that question?
I think a better question is, what can we learn from Jan Hus's story about sainthood itself?
Okay, I like that. So rather than getting hung up on the yes or no.
Exactly, because his life raises a lot of questions about the lines between different Christian traditions, what it really means to be a follower of Christ.
I think that's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the yes or no, but there's a bigger conversation to be had here, right?
Absolutely.
Hold that thought. We'll be back to unpack those bigger questions right after this.
Exactly. Because his life raises a lot of questions about the lines between different Christian traditions, what it really means to be a follower of Christ.
I think that's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the yes or no, but there's a bigger conversation to be had here, right?
Absolutely. One thing Huss's story really highlights is that the lines between different Christian traditions, well, they can be kind of blurry sometimes.
Yeah, that's true.
You've got this Catholic priest, and he's trying to reform his own church, but he ends up advocating for practices that are, like, deeply rooted in Orthodoxy.
Like communion in both kinds.
Exactly. And that's something that still divides Catholics and Orthodox Christians even today.
It really does make you wonder, if he had been born in a different place or time, would he have found himself more at home in the Orthodox Church?
It's definitely possible, but I think what's more important is that his story really challenges us to look beyond those labels,
What do you mean?
to focus on the core of the Christian faith. What does it actually mean to be a follower of Christ? And how do we live that out in a world that's so often divided by all this dogma and doctrine?
Those are some big questions for sure. I'm also struck by how Huss's story speaks to the power of individual conscience. He saw all this corruption and hypocrisy going on within the church, and he wasn't afraid to speak out against it.
Absolutely. And even when it meant going up against the most powerful figures of his time.
He really did put himself on the line.
He did. And I think that's a crucial point. True faith isn't about blind obedience, right?
No, I don't think so.
It's about seeking truth and having the courage to stand up for what you believe, even when it's hard.
That's a good point.
And that, in many ways, is really the essence of sainthood. It's not just about performing miracles or living some, like, perfectly pious life.
So it's about more than outward appearances.
Exactly. It's about having that courage to follow your conscience, to live in accordance with, your understanding of God's will, whatever the consequences.
Which brings us back to that moment before Huss's execution, his reciting of the Jesus prayer. Do we know if that was a common practice?
For those being condemned as heretics, not that I'm aware of, no.
So he deliberately chose to say it.
We can't say for sure, but it does add another layer to his story.
As
right?
star.
I mean, this is a prayer that's at the very heart of Orthodox spirituality.
Right.
It's not just any prayer. So the fact that he chose to utter this specific prayer in his final moments, well, it's hard not to see that as significant.
It's almost like even if he wasn't consciously converting to Orthodoxy, something was drawing him towards that tradition on a spiritual level.
It's a very compelling thought.
Sure.
And it leads to another question about sainthood.
What's that?
Can someone be considered a saint within a faith they didn't formally belong to?
That's a tough one. I'm not sure I have an answer to that.
It's something theologians have debated for centuries,
Yeah.
There's no easy answer.
What are some of the arguments?
Well, some folks believe sainthood is totally tied to being a member of a specific religious tradition.
They'd say you can't be a saint in a church you don't belong to.
Right. But others argue that true holiness goes beyond those boundaries.
Transcends denominations.
Exactly. It's a question that doesn't have a simple yes or no answer.
I see what you mean. So even if we don't have a definitive answer, Huss's life really forces us to think about these deeper questions of faith, belonging, what it means to be a Christian.
That's what makes him such a fascinating figure.
It sounds like we're moving toward wrapping things up. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
I think, what we've seen with Jan Hus is that he's this fascinating paradox.
What way?
Well, he was a Catholic priest, right. But he was also this radical reformer who wanted to bring back some of those earlier traditions.
And some of those traditions really do align with Orthodoxy.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
even if we never figure out the whole sainthood question,
Yeah, the is he or isn't he an Orthodox saint debate.
right? Even if we never settle that, his life still brings up a lot of other interesting points.
And it sparks a bigger conversation.
It does.
Something you said earlier really resonated with me. You were talking about how we should venerate saints because of their holiness, not just because they opposed, a certain group.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And honestly, it applies to more than just how we view saints.
What do you mean?
I think it's about how we approach interfaith dialogue as a whole.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
When we define ourselves by what we're against, we miss out on all those chances for understanding and growth.
It's like focusing on the differences instead of the things we share.
Exactly. And, true faith, it should be about love and understanding, not animosity.
It's about building bridges, not walls.
That's a great way to put it. Finding that common ground, appreciating those different perspectives.
And Jan Hus is such a good example of this. I mean, his story shows us how complicated faith can be, how those lines between traditions can get blurry. There are valuable lessons to be learned in those gray areas, that's for sure.
There are. It reminds us that truth can be found in so many different forms.
And that sometimes the most profound insights, they come when you step outside of your comfort zone.
Absolutely. When you engage with those different perspectives.
Because that's how we challenge our own assumptions.
Right. And that's how we deepen our understanding of faith.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Jan Hus,
It's been a great discussion.
it really has. I think the big takeaway here is this. Whether or not Jan Hus is officially an Orthodox saint, his story still gives us some really valuable insights.
Insights into faith, courage, integrity.
All those
He really was a remarkable figure.
He was. And for everyone listening, I think we'll leave you with this one last thought-provoking question.
What's that?
Can someone be considered a saint within a faith they didn't formally belong to?
That's the question. I really encourage all of you to, go and explore the life and writings of Jan Hus. Ponder that question.
It's a question worth thinking about. And to everyone listening, until next time, keep diving deep.